Hey class, it's me, Eric. I'm here to present my paper and at the same time be at a Radiohead concert. Um, I'd like to thank Dr. Katz for letting me experiment with the technology so that hopefully I can get some good feedback from you and I can elaborate about my paper. And in some way, hopefully this is a consolation for me not being in class tonight. Let me start with the title of my paper, which is called A Reader's Response to the Blending of Identities and the Expectation for You. My research focused on the concept and construction of identities, focused on Fauconnier and Turner's The Way We Think, and I applied their concepts of construction of identity to the identity of the first-person narrator in Kevin Stein's American Ghost Roses. What first drew me to Stein's collection was this amorphous, constantly evolving, yet consistently identifiable narrator. The narrator of Stein's poetry is constantly blending different identities together, but at the same time, throughout the collection, he is identifiable as the writer. Secondly, I began to investigate how this first-person narrator affected the reader. So I started to look at the first-person frame of the you-I relationship, and as I studied the relationship of the narrator and the reader, I found that the narrator, constantly identifying with the writer, was able to take the you-I form and the artist narrator form and identify the reader as the critic. Let me explain that one more time. The narrator identifies himself with the writer, and by forming a relationship with the reader, he begins to turn the reader or create expectations of the reader that turn the reader into a critic. So basically, in that form, and the form of the writer and the reader, Stein closes the proximity between the two. And as the book evolves, I notice three things happening. First, like I said, Stein closes the proximity between the narrator and the reader. And in fact, one poem I focus on, which is called To the Reader, Awakened by a Noisy Furnace, the narrator by the end of the poem is climbing into bed with the reader. And obviously this requires a pretty advanced blend. And what's happening is by entering the frame that the reader's in and by identifying with the reader, the proximity is closed and the narrator is able to speak for the reader, which is going to be significant later on. So secondly, this allows the narrator as the poet to not only speak for other personas and identities, but to speak for the reader as well. What I found happening is that through blends, through taking on qualities of the artist or of the contemporary situation that a reader would have in common with Stein, Stein is able to speak for those individuals. And then at the climax, or at a climactic part of my paper, which is the explanation of Kandinsky, a poem called Kandinsky Concerning the Spiritual in Art, Stein actually challenges the reader and sets up expectations for the reader. He says, a line from the poem is, "Make what you will." He is suggesting to the reader, in making a distinction between high art and low art in the poem, he's suggesting to the reader that the reader is the critic, and in the first person frame using you, he is saying to the reader, you, who he's already identified who's his audience, that they make what they will of high and low art, and they are the ones who put the artifact into categories. So, putting this expectation to the reader to become the critic, the reader must then come to terms with Stein's narrator, who self-professedly, if that's a word, it might not be, probably is not, is able to speak for the multitudes. Throughout the collection, Stein speaks for someone who's lost a loved one. He speaks for teenage angst. He speaks for the reader, like we said. And actually, at the end, he speaks to Jimi Hendrix for the artist, in the name of the artist. And this ability to speak for everyone and have a voice that is cast out, that adapts the identities of other personas and the audience in particular, this is what the reader must judge Stein on, is the conclusion of my paper. And that ability to blend identities is what the reader must make something of. And that's the conclusion I came to. And like I said in the title, it is in the form of a reader's response. So I looked at the beginning to the end of the book, and I picked out certain poems and tried to show how they exemplified an evolving persona that is adapting different voices, yet at the same time is consistently identifiable in each frame and poem, or each subject matter situation. So hopefully this is a nice informal presentation over technology. And I will be, hopefully, while you're all sharing a beer at One World, rocking out to Radiohead. Well, I had a great time in class, and hopefully this can spark some questions. Thank you.